Okay, so thanks everyone for joining. I'm just gonna, I think, talk a little bit about AI and ML. So I think some of the previous speakers, I think Dipesh talked about it. Mr. Uh, we also learned like how much explosion we are seeing overall, and how digital is going to be the future for mobility and transport in general. So I'm going to just touch a little bit upon how AI and ML plays into this, and maybe just share a couple of examples. Some of these examples may be again, because the diversity in everyone attending is very large. Some of this may be too sort of simplistic. Some of it, hopefully, you find very interesting. So let's get started. So very quickly, starting off with my personal introduction. So my background, in sort of before my current startup, I used to lead a bunch of product teams at Ola and Grab. Currently, I have a startup called Next Billion AI, where we're building very customized mapping solutions for mobility and logistics, essentially transportation and logistics sectors. Uh, I'm not going to be talking too much about my startup, but just in case anyone is curious, happy to take Q&A. But roughly, we are building very customized mapping solutions, mapping and location, because for many companies that operate in mobility or logistics, Google or any other maps provider doesn't quite work for one reason or another. And yeah, so let's just jump in. I think starting off with sort of the big picture first. I think this is probably became obvious from some of the previous talks as well, but mobility is a very fundamental need of in each and every one of us. So by some estimates across large cities in India, a number of urban passenger trips taking place per day across all modes of transportation is almost greater than 400 million. India spends roughly 14% of its GDP on transportation and logistics. And mobility as a service that's rapidly growing, it's estimated to be greater than $100 billion market by 2025. Uh, uh, and it's a very large part of our life, as Dipesh also mentioned, that we spend almost 2 hours, so 1 hour one way, so 2 hours going back and forth to office every day. And because of a lot of this mobility and how mobility affects cities, it's a very critical part of how governments and policies are designed and how urban planning is done, and very intricately linked to a design of sort of smart cities in the future. Um, and as sort of mobility as a service grows, and how ride hailing and other newer mobility models are picking up, it's also leading to a huge explosion in data. So for example, just globally, something like 50 million trips happen on ride hailing platforms. In India, Ola, Uber average 3 million trips per day. And through all of these, they're collecting almost hundreds of terabytes of data every day. Um, and when you're operating at a scale of that fashion, it's very critical to, you cannot really just do everything based on human intuition and judgment. And it's very critical to derive insights from data to optimize both the customer experience as well as business efficiency. Uh, and with better algorithms, better hardware, a lot more focus on big data, etc. AI and ML are increasingly driving very large portions of key portions of your mobility experience. And so I'm gonna, in the next section, what I'm gonna talk about is a couple of examples. Taking a ride-hailing lens, that's also a lens which, it's a place that's seeing the biggest adoption of how digital operates, how consumers are consuming mobility services every day. Uh, so this slide is how, for example, a typical ride-hailing customer journey could look like. You open the app, you specify your pickup and drop-off location, the app quotes your price, you like the price, you say, okay, get me a driver or book now. A driver, company or the app looks for a driver that's hopefully not too far away from you. The driver comes, picks you up. Maybe you chat with the driver, you call the driver, hey, I'm here, where are you? Uh, and then the driver drops you off. So while an AI and ML play a very central role through this entire journey, I'm going to talk about a couple of examples within this, which hopefully gives you a sense of how much AI and ML, which so while you open the app and you see, hey, something like, yeah, I pressed book and I got a driver, or I put in my home and I'm going from home to office. Why is it that the price tends to fluctuate somewhat every day? Why is it a certain price at 2 p.m. versus 7 p.m., et cetera, et cetera. So hopefully, we peel some layers of the onion and it gives you a flavor of, how big a role machine learning, et cetera, is playing into this. So let's focus on the first part. So you've put in your pickup and drop off location, and you get a price. Um, now, traditionally, if you were booking a regular taxi, this is what it might look like. So let's say you're going from CV Raman Nagar to Embassy Golf Links, let's say. Now, a traditional taxi company might use a typical rate card, which is something like, hey, some base fare plus per kilometer fare times whatever is the total expected distance. So this is what you might have paid in Bangalore, assuming your auto driver was actually following the meter. You would pay some fare of this fashion. Now, the question is, in a more digital, in a more data-driven world, is there an opportunity for us to do something better than this? And the key insight that comes in is that transportation fundamentally, or mobility, it's a network phenomena. It's not just point to point. It's not one person taking a ride from a pickup location to a drop off location, but it's really sort of a network phenomenon. And let's go into this as an example. For the non-Bangalore folks dialing in, just think of it as maybe some office location, maybe residential, and you're going to an office, a commercial office complex. So one of the insights is, let's say if you were taking a ride from a residential area to an office complex at 5:30 p.m., most likely that office complex in evening peak hours probably has excess demand and very little supply, because many people are leaving offices, going home, and therefore there is an opportunity. If you look at the entire network as a whole, it probably makes sense to encourage more trips of this fashion, as opposed to encouraging trips that are going away from this location. So therefore, what you can do here, and what companies do actually, is estimate in real time and use AI to predict across the city at all points what is the supply demand imbalance going to look like. And for example, here, this is Embassy Golf Links area. You see there's a huge, around 6 p.m., there's going to probably be a huge surge in demand and just not enough supply. And this is where, for example, companies would encourage, actually give you maybe a slight discount on your base fare, computed just simply on your base fare and per kilometer fare, and hopefully to encourage more cars and more supply going there to meet the expected surge in demand. And all of this leads to better network efficiency, better asset utilization, better customer experience, faster allocation that's closer to you, etc. So this is an example. Another sort of pricing example, again, related to sort of a peak, non-peak hour phenomena is, now so far we looked at sort of a customer lens and a network lens. Let's now maybe look at a driver lens. Now let's say, we're looking at Mangala to HSR. Now, one time slot we're looking at is 2 p.m., which is non-peak hours. Maybe the trip on an average takes, say, 15 minutes. The same trip in peak hours could take maybe as much as like half an hour. Now, if you're a driver and we use a similar rate card, which is some base fare plus per kilometer fare times something, you would feel cheated. You would feel, hey, I am spending maybe even as much as 50% extra effort, 80% extra effort, going from one location to another, but I am getting paid the same. And what this might result in is the driver is like, hey, you know what? I am only going to operate in non-peak hours. I'm actually not going to operate in peak hours because it doesn't feel worth the time and the effort I'm putting in. And this is where, again, as a platform, it becomes super critical to, for instance, estimate and predict traffic. And traffic prediction and traffic management is super central to the mobility experience overall. Now, if you were able to predict traffic better, you would be able to incorporate the fact that, hey, my driver is probably going to take a lot more time, uh, in peak hours or non-peak hours, and therefore I should, figure out a price accordingly. Now, if you're able to do that, your driver is happier because he feels, hey, you know the amount of effort I put in through the day, the returns I get is sort of consistent. And it's not like, hey, sometimes I get very high ROI on my effort, and at other times my ROI is very, very poor. uh, so this is an example. It's also very central to, for example, what Deepesh talked about, move and sync, where predictability of carpooling rides super central of ensuring you are able to get to your office in time. Again, traffic prediction and using AI to predict some of that becomes a very critical part. And often, just using, say, something like a Google Maps API or anything else just doesn't, serve the purpose, or it's just not good enough for some of these new age mobility companies. Uh, so that was sort of a view of pricing, and hopefully, and while this topic is super large, you can probably have 10 PhD people spend time trying to optimize pricing in every possible fashion. Hopefully that gives you some sense of how sort of there's a lot more that's there under the hood of when you just open the app and you put in a pickup drop off location and the number that comes to you. There's a lot that goes on behind the scenes to actually just make that experience as simple as you see it, as you experience it. Uh, Another example I'm going to give is allocation. So okay, you like the price, you press book, and yeah, and you get allocated you just get allocated a driver that comes picks you up. Now, again, let's sort of go through some example of how easy or sort of what really goes on under the hood. So let's take an example here. Maybe in some neighborhood, there are sort of 3 people requesting for cabs, and maybe there are 4 idle drivers or cars nearby. Now you look at this example and you think, hey, you know what, should be simple enough. There are plenty of supply, plenty of cabs available for these 3 people. What could go wrong? So maybe I start off with something fairly simple. I say, hey, you know what, let me allocate for each person the driver who, or the cab that is closest to this person. So maybe, so I compute all these sort of n cross m combinations of how much time will this driver take to reach passenger 1, passenger 2, passenger 3, and so on. And I decide, hey, you know what, these are the combinations that make the most sense. And hopefully, everyone is happy, everyone gets a cab that's really close to them. But now, maybe our driver 4 does not like you know where passenger 3 is going, so he cancels because this trip is going in a direction he does not want to go in. Now, if you just look at this as a passenger, you're frustrated because you're like, hey, I see so many cabs nearby, but why am I not getting a cab? Similarly, the driver is like, man, I'm waiting, I just don't get a good trip. It leads to very poor sort of network efficiency and margins for the platform, because really from a mobility platform's perspective, asset utilization or idle time is sort of the enemy. Uh, and again, so what seemed like a somewhat straightforward-ish example led to something that wasn't as optimal as we would like it to be. So the insight here, for example, is maybe our driver, Mr. Singh, lives around the maybe near Yelahanka, near the airport. So towards the end of the day, our driver only wants trips that are going in that direction and does not want to be going anywhere else. So if, let's say, you're leaving, Belandur, end of your workday, and you're going towards Banerghatta, maybe Mr. Singh does not want to take that trip because his day is coming to a close. He wants to be going near the airport so that he can be with his family after 8 p.m. And this is where again, you know, ideally you use AI and machine learning on a very large number of factors. So obviously pickup times is one, driver preferences, what kind of payment modes do drivers like. Maybe your driver does not want to receive money in the form of Paytm or credit cards. He only wants cash. Or it could be that, hey, you know what? This passenger has rated this driver horribly in the past. So he or she is very unlikely to be taking this trip. So in case we do this, we match this passenger with this driver, very likely that this passenger will end up canceling. Or maybe you're trying to optimize for safety. Uh, there's a female passenger that's likely to be sharing a cab. uh, Therefore you only want to be matching this passenger, especially because she's going to an area that's somewhat isolated, known for bad safety incidents. So you only want to be matching very highly rated drivers. So ideally, the way to arrive at an optimal driver allocation strategy is to use AI on a very large number of factors, and hopefully doing it in real time rapidly, so that you can arrive at the optimal allocation strategy. Uh, so yeah, I think this was sort of the intro that I had. Happy to take questions. But yeah, I think the summary here is mobility as a service, is exploding, and that's also leading to a very large explosion in data. And it's really important to use AI and machine learning to drive at optimal customer experience and business efficiency. And just sort of sharing some data, uh, if using AI and machine learning across, across different parts of the customer, driver, and network experience, it's possible to obtain as much as 40%, maybe even higher efficiency using sort of a similar supply demand capacity. So there's a very large opportunity to drive better business efficiency, especially as uh, uh, we learned that margins and staying alive is probably the most important thing in the current time frame, and that's where AI and ML can really drive a lot of value.
Hey, thank you, Gaurav. Thank you very much. Actually, please stay back for the question answers.